We're going to wait just a couple of moments to let people kind of file in to the webinar. So wondering why we're just sitting here quietly. We'll go ahead and get started, especially just because we have a little bit of housekeeping to do in the beginning before we launch into the formal part of this webinar. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. I'm going to ask my fellow admissions professional, Joseph Lindsay, to introduce himself. And then I'll give you a brief roadmap of where we're going with this and what kind of the next hour looks like. First and foremost, so before I do that, you should be aware that we are not going to be monitoring the chat at all, but we will be using the Q&A function. So if you're watching this live and you have a question, you're welcome to submit a question in the Q&A. We'll either be able to respond to it in writing in that, or we'll save it for the end when we have time for questions at the very end of the program. So without further ado, I'm Kristen Thies-Alvarez. I'm the Dean of Admissions and Financial Aid at Berkeley Law School. I've been with the law school since 2007, and I oversee all of the JD admissions functions and then also the Financial Aid Office. And the Financial Aid Office is responsible for aid, not just for JD students, but also for our LLM program, JSD program, and JSP programs. And we also have a loan repayment assistance program, so we continue to work with alumni well into their careers. We'll ask Joseph now to briefly introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. My name is Joseph Lindsay. I'm the Director of Admissions and Operations at Berkeley Law. I've been at the law school for about 4 years, but I've been in law school admissions and financial aid, primarily financial aid, since 2002.
So Joseph is going to be managing the Q&A section, and also, Joseph, you should feel free to jump in and add anything if there's anything you think that I overlooked or any additional information that you can provide. Joseph is really an expert in financial aid in addition to admissions, so we are so happy to have him here on this webinar and happy to have him here at Berkeley Law. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen in order to get started. Hopefully everyone can see that. Thank you again. This is a session that is really entitled Paying for Law School Financial Aid 101. So we're going to talk a little bit about Berkeley Law because we'll use Berkeley Law as an example of programs and expenses and issues that you might want to pay attention to. But we are really thinking broadly about what are the basics of financial aid and financing a legal education. If you have Berkeley specific questions, of course, you can ask them in the Q&A. Later on this week, we're also doing a financial aid sort of office hours framed as an Ask Me Anything session. So if you have a more in-depth question or a question specific to Berkeley Law, you also could ask it there. And then before we go any farther, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of California and the city of Berkeley sits on the territory of Huchun, the ancestral and unceded homelands of the Chochenyo-speaking Ohlone people, who are themselves the successors of the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. This land is and continues to be of great importance to the Mwekma Ohlone and to all of the other familial descendants of the Verona Band who live or no longer live in this area. And we recognize particularly that every member of the Berkeley community, ourselves, the law school, our students, and everyone else who uses and occupies this space has benefited from and continues to benefit from use, occupation, and presence on this land since the institution's founding in 1868. We acknowledge that we have an explicit responsibility to make visible the university's relationship with Native peoples and communities. This land acknowledgement is an affirmation of Indigenous sovereignty, and we do continue to work to hold the larger institution accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So, as I suggested, this is meant to be a Financial Aid 101 session. We're going to talk about the topic in two parts. The first is what's the cost of going to law school? The second will be how do you pay for it? Most people want to talk about how do we pay for it. We think it's really important to kind of lay the groundwork on what does it cost so that you know what we're talking about from the beginning. briefly, before we launch into the explicit costs of law school, tuition fees, et cetera, we wanted to acknowledge that there is a cost of applying to law school. So some of the costs are sort of listed here. There may be others, or it may be different for you, but it's not without cost, we understand, to engage in the application process at all. In fact, it can be extremely expensive if you're paying for LSAT prep courses or relocating, depending on the number of schools you're paying for or applying to, et cetera. Those costs can really add up. And then we also wanted to share our understanding of a few places where you can help minimize those costs of applying. The Law School Admissions Council offers a fee waiver that helps support LSAT and also credential assembly service costs. You also can register through them with the Candidate Referral Service, or CRS service, which allows schools to find you, and which may result in them finding you through email and also offering you a fee waiver to reduce the application fees that you have to pay. Law firm programs also exist in the world. So some of those are very elaborate pipeline programs, and some of those are not quite as well developed, but many of them include either LSAT prep or some support on the side of applying. There are also nonprofits. There are a few listed here that explicitly have pre-law financial support, and schools do host preparatory programs along the lines of the LSAC Plus program or UCLA Law Fellows. The cost of law school. What does it cost to attend? Very explicitly, there is a cost of attendance. And the reason that we put this slide up is mainly to differentiate between the cost of attendance and the tuition and fees. So most of the time when you go to a school's website or you open up its view book, the first number that you see, and it is a large number often, is the tuition and fees. But it is important that you understand that cost of attendance is much more than that. It's often not as high as tuition and fees. It's usually some proportion of that, but it is not an insignificant expense. So cost of attendance is the overall student budget. It assumes that you're a single student with no dependents, and it includes all of the things you would be billed for by the school and expected expenses that you wouldn't directly be billed for, but of course are completely predictable, like paying rent and buying food and buying books. It's important to remember that's an estimate, so your actual cost could be less or more depending on your personal circumstances. If you find rent that is much more and that pushes you well beyond the typical cost of attendance, you might be able to make a change. And it is tied to usually to 9-month academic year expenses, so it doesn't account for sort of expenses in the summers, for example. There are ways that you can individualize cost of attendance. Everyone gets packaged, or that's what we say, it's financial aid, given or offered a financial aid package with sort of a standard COA in mind. But either as a enrolling student or a continuing student, it is possible to work with the financial aid office in order to do a cost of attendance adjustment request. Those do have to be reviewed, and they do have to comply with institutional and federal policy. But again, if you have unusual but educationally related expenses, you need to buy new computer hardware, you need to pay for childcare. Those things are potentially things that could add to your cost of attendance. If those cost of attendance adjustment or CORs are approved, what that means is that the total student budget is increased to account for those increases in costs. But importantly, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to get a scholarship to cover them. In fact, most people who are approved for a cost of attendance adjustment request, what the result is that there's increased federal loan eligibility, and so they're able to borrow more. It is also really key here going in to note that CORs, or in general, federal student aid, can only be used for educationally related expenses. So it doesn't cover things like consumer debt if you have a large car payment or significant credit card debt, or even bar exam prep on the other end. Those things are not included within the federal aid programs, including eligibility for loans. So what does this look like in action? This is just an example. It's the Berkeley Law example. Tuition and fees here listed by both California resident and non-resident. You can see there's a differential of about $5,000 to $6,000 this year. And then living expenses, and Northern California happens to be a place that's relatively expensive compared to many places in this country to live. So for us, that's about $33,500. We also list student health insurance as an expense, but importantly, this can be waived. So if you were covered by a partner or a parent's health insurance, you could have your total cost of attendance or your student budget reduced by that amount. And so what you get is a total cost, which, as you can see, is more than just tuition and fees, substantially so. Might be a little bit less if you can waive out of student health insurance, might be a little bit less if you have lower living expenses, might be a little bit more if you have childcare or other expenses and need to make an adjustment. Just to drill down a little deeper, to give you some sense of what tuition and fees includes and what living expenses typically includes. This again is a Berkeley example, but some version of this is true at every school. We charge tuition in a couple of different chunks. There's something called tuition, which campus charges. And then there is what we would call PDST, or the professional degree supplemental tuition. That's the bulk of the expense, and it is for law students specifically. There's also NRST, which stands for non-resident supplemental tuition. So if you're a California resident, it's zero. If you were a non-resident, it's an additional $12,000 or so. There's a law materials fee, which is very small. Some other campus fees, the class pass fee, which is a bus fee, student services, et cetera. And again, there's that health insurance that may or may not be included. Those are things that you would be billed for. They show up on your bill, and whatever financial aid you're receiving, including loans, applies towards that. And then if you have more financial aid than those costs, a payment to you is issued, or a refund, and you get a check, or even better, an electronic funds transfer show up, and you can use that to then buy the things you aren't billed for, covering your rent and utilities for the year, transportation, personal expenses, food, books, and supplies. Zooming out to give you a wider range of this, we wanted to give you a sample of sort of annual tuition and living expenses nationally. These are all from full-time public and private ABA accredited law schools across the United States, who all have very different US News and World Report rankings for the 2022 ranking. So at the top row, you can see tuition ranging at one school, which is clearly a public school or a state school, for a resident of that state from $21,803. And I should say this is not the lowest one that I found, but it's close to it, all the way up to what happens to be a private institution on the East Coast, where the tuition and fees alone is nearly $75,000. I don't have a sense, off the top of my head, of the distribution of these across the 200 or so ABA accredited law schools. I often just say that the thing that you should take away is that law school is pretty expensive, but there may be less expensive options. The star in the middle there is sort of where Berkeley falls along this spectrum. And then on the living expenses side, again, in this happens to be a Southwestern state, living expenses are estimated very low at $15,000, almost $16,000. There's a range. You saw previously that Berkeley's is about 33, but I also found a school that was a private school in California where it was about $42,000 that they were estimating. You'll see here that there's a note that unless it's offset in some way, it is very reasonable and in fact good to assume that every year you're in law school, the school will likely increase tuition. And usually that's about a 2 or 3% increase, but it could be more or it could be less. Again, living expenses are entirely estimates. So key takeaways from this, obviously law school is a significant investment. You want to think about applying as well as attending. You really should think about getting your sort of finances in order, or at least bringing awareness for yourself to your financial situation before planning on attending. And what I mean by that is, run a credit report just to check it for accuracy. Nobody is worried about your credit score, but sometimes things are on there that can surprise you and need to be remediated in some way. And then also, as much as possible, pay down consumer debt, because again, you cannot use financial aid to pay for that. And for some people, that would really make things difficult. Cost of attendance is a lot more than just tuition and fees. Your circumstances might be different. Schools have a wide range. But more than anything, what I hope that you'll take away too is that you shouldn't totally be scared off by this. This is not the point where you should exit the webinar and go, well, law school is too expensive, I guess I'm not going. This is all sort of the sticker price of law school, but it only tells half of the story. So we're about to get into the other half, which is, well, how on earth do people pay for that if they're not just pulling out a checkbook and writing a check? And most people are not doing that. So I just want to prepare you to understand when you look at websites or you look at view books, what this information means, but don't be intimidated by it. It is not the case that most people or all people are simply paying that total. So let's talk about how do most people pay for it, or how do people pay for it? Everyone's situation is a little bit different. There are two basic types of financial aid. And I think this is an important slide, even though it's kind of an obvious one, because mostly when we say financial aid, people do not think about loans. They think financial aid equals scholarships and grants. In fact, financial aid equals anything that's provided to you to allow you to attend that school and to pay your tuition and fees and live during the academic year. So it absolutely includes loans. Obviously, loans are a type of aid that you have to repay at some point after graduation, usually. And then what we refer to as gift aid, also known as grants or scholarships, are things that awards that you do not have to repay. Most people are really just interested in gift aid, and we totally understand that. It makes perfect sense. You should be an effective advocate for yourself and maximize your gift aid options. At the same time, we are going to talk a little bit about loans just so that you're aware of what that looks like. So in the landscape of loans for law school, most of the time when people say loans, they're talking about federal loans. There are two primary types: unsubsidized loans. If any of you went to law school or went to school, excuse me, a long time ago, you might remember like, hey, there was both sub and unsub. So there are not subsidized loans for law school anymore. That has gone away. So there's not these sort of two types, a subsidized and an unsubsidized. And for the record, subsidized simply means that your interest is sort of not accruing while you're in school. So there's federal unsubsidized, and then there's federal graduate plus loans. And I'm going to talk more about those in a minute, but they're really critical for most people who are going to be borrowing in order to borrow for law school. There are institutional loans. These come into play less frequently, but a law school may itself make loans to students, or a campus may. Those might be things like emergency loans, as listed here. So someone who needs a short-term infusion of cash in order to pay a bill, but then the next term is financial aid. They're either repaying it or it's being pulled out of their aid offer. Or some schools have donors who've offered to make students what they think of as a forgivable loan. So offer them an award and tell them, oh, you need to work in public interest for 5 years, and then the loan will be forgiven. And if you don't, it will convert back into a loan. Another type of institutional loan that can be important, that's just out there, and it's not the case at Berkeley. We don't actually offer these, but there are schools that recognize that international students are not eligible for federal loans, either unsubsidized or grad plus, and therefore they make sort of loans or have relationships with lenders. And so if you're an international student, that might be something that you keep an eye out for. And then there are private loans, and there used to be a really, really active and robust sort of marketplace for private loans and private lenders. And then we really went towards a model where basically the Department of Education or the federal government is just making loans. There are now, again, some private lenders. They do a variety of things. Some of them do lend, again, to international students, typically with a US cosigner only. There are other private lenders that do, you'll probably seen, advertisements for them at like the post-grad consolidation phase, with putting all your loans together, maybe getting a lower interest point. There are a lot of trade-offs to be aware of that I'm not going to talk in great depth about with private versus federal loans. If you're thinking about going into public interest and you're not sure what this looks like, I would really encourage you to come to our session later this week on loan repayment assistance program, because the question of whether or not private loans make sense for you may actually very much dovetail with the question of whether or not you're planning to go into public interest work and need the potential to be able to qualify for federal public service loan forgiveness. Things to think about with all of these are what types, who's eligible for them, what their borrowing limits are, what the interest is, how frequently that interest is recalculated, what the repayment terms are, and whether there's an option for forgiveness. Another differentiating point might be origination fees, so the fees that the banks themselves charge to originate or to start their loans, but typically that's sort of included in the larger financial aid offer. So I just wanted to take a moment to talk about federal student loans kind of in action, because I think if you're recently in undergrad or less familiar with law school or professional school funding opportunities, this is often missed. So there's a limit. So for example, for us, we only offer $20,500 in federal unsubsidized loan. And if you only could offer that loan, then somebody who only had that plus $8,000 in their savings, so student A, for example, on this page, is going to have a shortfall of, a significant amount of money, $50,000 or so, that they would theoretically have to either go to a private lender for or come up with on their own, which most people couldn't do. And so Graduate Plus loans provide a really important role, or play a really important role, because that they do is they look at what you already have and then sort of fill in the gap up to full cost of attendance. So there will be people, for example, who don't have savings and don't have need-based aid and don't have outside awards and don't have merit-based aid, but who through acceptance of federal unsubsidized loans and federal Graduate Plus loans are actually able to borrow up to their full cost of attendance. So they would still be able to come to law school. We can have a debate about whether or not that makes a lot of sense for them. But if their dream is to come to law school and that is the only resource available, this is why it's critical that you understand that federal loans and loans in general are in fact a form of financial aid. They do allow access. On the flip side, obviously, then there's, student B over here who also got other types of aid that we're going to talk about in a minute, that the good type, that's probably what you're thinking, the type they don't have to repay, and therefore their Graduate Plus loan is less. They didn't actually have to borrow the $51,000, they only had to borrow $32,000. And in fact, they couldn't have borrowed $51,000 because when we start to post non-loan aid, it reduces the loan eligibility because you cannot get financial aid usually over your cost of attendance or over the student budget. One really important note is that when we tell students this over and over again, that you don't actually have to accept 100% of the loans that are offered to you. So you could have student B who's offered $32,000 in Grad Plus, but goes, actually, you know what, I'm living with a couple of roommates and I can live pretty cheaply, and I'm going to work some this summer. So I actually think I'm only going to borrow about $10,000 each semester. And then if halfway through the semester you need to borrow more, you do have some eligibility and you could work with the financial aid office to increase your borrowing. So loans, obviously, if we look back at this page for 1 second, you look at student A and they're going to be, if tuition stayed exactly the same and all of this was predictable and somehow they had $8,000 every year, they would be about $153,000 in debt. No, excuse me, more than that. 50 plus 70, $210,000 in debt at graduation. And so a lot of people immediately are sort of like, okay, great, you just said federal loans create access, but come on, do they really? And of course they do, but it matters tremendously the context, and that context is usually the postgraduate context. So the outcomes on the other side, and whether to your mind, and it does become a personal choice, it justifies the investment in terms of the indebtedness. And usually what that question is am I going to get a job? And the next question is, how much will I be making? If you're going into the private sector, you should look at this information for each school you may be considering. I put the Berkeley Law examples up here to give you a sense of, how many people have jobs, what kinds of jobs they have, which matters. And we'll talk about public interest work in a moment. And then what the starting salary is of those jobs. So if you think you might go into a large law firm, or you're open to that possibility, or you're excited about it, for our graduates, and this is specific to Berkeley, the median starting salary was $190,000. You get out of law school, you start a job, that's your salary. So for a lot of people, even though the borrowing can be really intimidating, it makes sense for them given what their career objectives are. And they can sort of justify it, or to think about it, what's the return on investment? I'm investing these dollars in the form of loans into my education. What's the return? If somebody said you could borrow $250,000 1 year, and then for the next 30 years, it would pay you a minimum of $200,000, maybe much more, you'd probably say that's a pretty good investment. That is not how everyone thinks about this. And I do just want to acknowledge that. It's certainly when I was a student was not how I was thinking about paying for law school, but it is one way to approach this question. Another thing to note, just briefly is that I listed the large law firm summer associate pay, and actually people get paid relatively well in summer associate positions. Again, not a thing that everyone wants to do or has access to, but for a lot of people, part of how they manage is their borrowing from year to year is that actually they do work for a law firm in the summer, they live really frugally, and then they use a significant portion of their summer earnings to offset the cost of law school in the second and third year. So briefly, public interest financial support, because if you're making $190,000, it may make a lot of sense to go into significant debt to earn a law degree. If you're making $60,000, you may be scratching your head and wondering what that looks like and whether that makes any sense at all. So I'm going to talk about public interest financial support during law school and post-grad. So again, this is using Berkeley as an example, but I think it's a pretty typical framework for many schools. We do provide guaranteed summer public interest funding. So many organizations that are working in public service don't have the ability to pay that $30,000. We are also not going to be able to provide you with $30,000 to work at a public interest organization over the summer, but we can provide you with enough money so that you'll be able to live and function. So typically that's between about $5,000 and $6,000. We also have public interest fellowships postgraduate and what are known as bridge fellowships. Those are again to provide some sort of shorter term support for people entering the field after graduation. And then we do have a public interest scholars program, which I'll talk a little bit more about. And that's front end financial aid that's available to people. It's application based and it is competitive. On the back end, after law school, you may be aware, or maybe you aren't, that there is a whole world of what are called LRAP programs, or loan repayment assistance programs, or LRAPs. And we do have an LRAP program. I would encourage you to go online and check out the details of it. I'm not going to express all of those in any great detail here, but really importantly, I think from a student's perspective or a consumer perspective is just to think about how to compare loan repayment assistance programs. In my experience, most law schools that offer them think that they're doing a pretty good job. They know why they offer them. They know what kind of support they provide. They know what their graduates are doing, and they feel pretty good about it. The question is it going to be right for you what their LRAP program actually offers? So questions you want to ask as you sort of dig into this is what kind of a job can I get? So we're saying loan repayment assistance programs help you manage your postgraduate debt by helping you pay your federal student loans. If you're in a public interest job, which is probably low paying, but also really critical work, meeting the needs of underserved communities, et cetera. So the question then of what's that job becomes important. What if you want to do a job as a policy analyst in government? Does that qualify? Is it using your law degree or not? So schools may have different definitions of qualifying employment. You're going to want to think about what types of loans are eligible. So again, private, public only, how much loans could be covered, what repayment plans you have to be in, how much you could earn, whether there's sort of accounting for leaves that you might need to take, or marriage or dependents, or being dual income, for example, how long you have to enter them and how long they support students. There probably are others. Again, if you're thinking public service is the way you're going to go and you're thinking, well, it sounds like loans are going to be a part of my future to some extent, I would strongly encourage you again to attend that loan repayment assistance program session later this week. Footnote here, and an important one, is that I have talked for the last 10 minutes on the assumption that everybody's eligible for federal loans. And not everybody is eligible for federal loans. So international students, non-US citizens are not going to be eligible for federal loans. Undocumented students or DACA recipients not going to be eligible for federal loans. Some students with very particular criminal convictions are not going to be eligible for student loans. That's a pretty narrow set of circumstances. So if you're having a panic attack worrying about your case, you can check it out online, but it is not a broad statement of all criminal convictions. It's some very narrow circumstances. And then students with adverse credit, and actually this is a point of distinction here. So for federal unsubsidized loans, generally is not an issue at all. But for graduate plus loans, they do look at whether or not you have adverse credit. Importantly, that is different than whether or not you have good credit or bad credit. So they're not running your credit report and checking your score. It's not a mortgage. They're not saying, well, sorry, we only want people with over 750 on their credit score or something like that. What they're looking for is things that you have like borrowed and then literally not paid. So they're looking at things like bankruptcies. They're looking at things like evictions. They're looking at other kind of bill collection actions. This is why it's important to run your credit report, just so you know going in what you're dealing with and can make corrections if they need to be made. I've worked with a fair number of students who got a really unpleasant surprise when they learned that a family member had taken a credit card out in their name that they had no awareness of and not paid it, or that cellular service they signed up for 3 years ago and then hated, so they just changed one. They never fulfilled the contract of it, and so they actually still owed $500 on the phone they got, and that has sort of gone to collections or something like that. So you just don't want to be surprised, and the financial aid office of any school can work with you on this. There is an appeals process. So if you get turned down for a graduate plus loan, the financial aid office of a law school would typically reach out to you, and it is possible to sort of appeal that by having taken steps to remediate it, et cetera. So it is not necessarily an absolute barrier, but it is an issue that comes up from time to time. Oh, I will talk about a little bit more about undocumented students and DACA recipients. This is where the school's policies and the state that the school is in, if it's a public school, starts to matter a lot. So it's a little hard to make general statements about what's available, but we are happy to answer questions as much as possible. So moving along to talk about other kinds of gift aid. So generally gift aid means scholarships and grants. We use those terms all kind of pretty interchangeably. Those awards could be merit-based, they could be a combination of merit and need, or they could be need-based. There may be programmatic awards, which means, usually it's a scholarship with a name, and it comes with sort of designation as a particular recipient of that scholarship, and it may come with programming. So you might get, a mentor, or there might be a seminar or something along those lines. And then gift aid awards could be one time, so single semester or year, or they could be renewable. We'll talk a little bit more of that in a second. This is really key. So when we say merit, the thing to know is that we're not all talking about the same thing. Law schools. So every law school defines merit differently and particular to them. For some schools, they may really just mean LSAT and GPA. For other schools, they are taking a comprehensive look at all of your materials. That's our approach. But again, it just has to do with the institution and what their goals are and how they best want to achieve those goals. So when someone says, oh yeah, we offer merit-based scholarships, you may want to ask them what merit means at their institution and how that is determined. Similarly, need is defined differently at every institution. And any school that does need-based aid, and not all schools do, often requires a supplemental application, and that application may be different for every single school. So bad news, after you apply to law school, you're not done applying for things. If you get into a school that has a need-based aid program, you typically will be filling out at least one other application, and that's not including the FAFSA, which you have to complete for federal loan eligibility, and that would be a school-specific need assessment. So again, the question of whether you're an independent or a dependent of your parents, the question of whether the school considers things like parental home equity, the question of how the school treats spousal income, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, can be really different and can result in a different calculation, both of eligibility for need-based aid and amount of need-based aid. Mostly I say this just so you're prepared to see lots of different results coming out of different schools, and also so that you don't contact the schools sort of upset that one school offered you X amount in need-based aid and you can't believe that this other school didn't offer you need-based aid. Please understand that we approach these questions very differently. Programmatic awards vary by school. Usually they're listed on the website or even in the application. One really important note here is even though we are different schools with different programs and definitions and deadlines, we should not require commitments from anyone prior to April 15th. And I can talk more about that if we need to. The fine print on gift aid, and remember, this is the aid you wanted, right? This is the I don't have to pay back aid. The fine print on it is important. So you should read carefully award letters or acceptance agreements that you were sent if you were offered gift aid. Some of the things to keep an eye out for are when you have to accept that aid. So a school might have a deposit deadline of June 15th, but they might offer you a large scholarship and then say your deadline to accept or to deposit or decline is May 1st. So pay careful attention to that. There may be interviews or other requirements kind of in that application process, and that's important. There also, just as a note, especially with programmatic awards, there might be different application deadlines just for admission. So for example, our Berkeley Law Opportunity Scholarship Program requires that you apply for admission no later than December 15th, even though in general, our application deadline is not until February 15th. You also want to keep an eye out for questions of renewability or scholarship retention. So is that award a one-year award or is it a three-year award? If it's a three-year award, what is it going to take for you to keep it in your second and third years? So is it automatically renewed as long as you're a full-time student making satisfactory academic progress? Or does it say that you have to maintain a GPA of 3.2 or be in the top 30% of the class in order to have your award renewed? Again, you just don't want to be surprised at the end of the first year when you get your grades back and then you get a financial aid offer for the next year and your scholarship is gone because you didn't recognize that you were no longer, or you were not going to be able to renew that award based on your academic performance. You might also keep an eye out again for other benefits of the award. There may be, as I suggested, things like mentorship or other opportunities and other requirements. Some awards will come with what's considered a moral obligation to repay. It is a moral obligation, not a legal one, but often they'll require that you sign a statement that you understand that you have a moral obligation if you're ever in a position to repay or to give back to support the school to make those awards available to other students. They might ask you to interact with donors, for example, if it's donor-based award. Just be careful and proceed with caution and don't make assumptions, and in particular don't make assumptions that the terms and conditions are going to be the same across schools. This is an example from Berkeley Law of a range of programs that are available at our school. Different schools are going to have different programs. We're not all the same. We don't do things the same, but we will have, both loans and gift aid, and that's fairly certain that all schools will be doing that at a minimum. I highlighted two things on this list only because I'm not going to talk about them anywhere else. One is that we actually offer a guaranteed scholarship of $75,000, $25,000 per year if you apply and are admitted through our binding early decision program. Not all binding early decision programs come with that. One of the problems with binding early decision programs is that if you accept them, then you're kind of locked in. If you apply what we call BED and then you get admitted, you're supposed to withdraw from everywhere else. So you kind of don't have any leverage or any negotiation power. And that can be problematic if you're trying to figure out how you're going to pay for it on the back end. So, we tied our binding early decision program award to about the average award for anyone who's receiving gift aid from Berkeley Law, so that there wasn't a real distinct disadvantage. I've seen different versions of this. There are some schools that do half tuition. There's at least one school that does a pretty significant award of about $50,000. I've seen another state school that gives everybody a waiver of their non-resident tuition. So just be aware of sort of the Downside of binding early decision being maybe you don't have as much leverage around aid. The upside being there are some schools who've proactively tried to address that. And then the other one listed here that I just wanted to point out are what we call PIOAs, which for us are PDST increase offset awards. If you'll remember, very long time ago in one of those earlier slides, PDST, professional degree supplemental tuition, is the largest sort of chunk of all of your required and billed fees. This does not offset all of PDST, but we, as I mentioned, typically fees go up every year. And PDST is sort of one of those fees that frequently goes up or regularly goes up or has been approved to go up. And so we made a decision a few years ago that we wanted to be able to offer people they'll pay the standard amount in their first year, but in the next year, if PDST goes up, we'll give them a scholarship that offsets that so that their sort of experience of the amount of PDST they actually have to pay is the same every year instead of growing each year that they are there. So some schools may do something like this to sort of protect students from tuition increases. It's relatively rare, however. Some examples of Berkeley Law programmatic awards. We have a public interest scholars program, as I suggested. We have a Berkeley Law Opportunity Scholars program, which I've mentioned. We also have a set of center scholars programs with the law and business, law and tech, environmental, social justice, and human rights centers. I really just put these here to illustrate kind of how different they can be from one another. So BLOS has an early deadline, PI Scholars doesn't. BLOS requires an extra essay, PI Scholars and Center Scholars doesn't. All of them are renewable. They might have different requirements, and they definitely may have different people looking at them and choosing who will receive them. However, I would also note that, for any of you who are sort of thinking law school wasn't for you when you saw what the price tag is, there are definitely programs out there, even within the law school itself, that provide up to full tuition and fees. And so for some students, they would really need to be coming up with the living expenses. It may be, since you're not working, that you're still borrowing that $30,000 a year for living expenses, which isn't insignificant, but obviously it's far better to end up $90,000 in debt, especially if you're going into public interest, than it is potentially to end up $300,000 in debt. There is also a whole world of outside gift aid. So law schools make awards, but so do lots of other groups. Regional and national scholarships exist. These can be very particular, things like the Minority Corporate Council, maybe selecting someone and you might get an email about it. State and county bar associations, but also diversity and affinity bar associations are options. Law firms will often have scholarships or related organizations that exist. Some of those might require you to do some work, like entering a writing competition, but that absolutely may be worth it to you. If you're an international student, there may be support from your home country. Tribal nations may have the resources to provide financial support for students of theirs who are enrolling at a law school. And there probably are others. So I have absolutely known students who sort of decided that they were going to borrow little or nothing and put in kind of what I sweat equity in terms of the amount of work that they did to be applying to outside scholarships constantly. But they did extremely well in that project. And so it is possible to significantly reduce the potential to have to borrow through applying externally. It just does require work and effort on the student's part. And obviously, as a law student, you have lots of other work and effort, but these may be very, very worth it. And I know normally when I do this presentation with Joseph, he'll often say, like, when you work in financial aid, sometimes there's obscure awards where, this particular bar association has been trying desperately to give away this $1,000 award and just can't find someone because nobody's applying for it. There is a real benefit to being the person who's out there actually applying for the particular awards, and $1,000 and $1,000 and $1,000 adds up relatively quickly. Last thing I think that I'm talking about is the world of scholarship negotiation. people at admissions and financial aid aren't really in general fans of the term negotiation, because we tend to see our work as extremely mission centered. We want to help students, so we want to help them get the education that they need to reach the goals that they're hoping to achieve. So we don't really want to feel like we're used car salesmen. At the same time, you know, there isn't a much better term to sort of make it clear what we're talking about, which basically is that it's a revisiting, or we call it a reconsideration of an offer that a school has made. So to my mind, there are three types of ways that schools do this. One is that they may have an informal program, maybe program's too strong of a word, an informal approach where they don't say anything about this on their website. They don't talk about it at an info session, but if you're an admitted student and you reach out to them through an email and you say like, hey, I really want to go there. I got this other offer. It's much better. I'm thinking about going there instead. They'll kind of play ball. Some schools are very clear that they have absolutely no program or interest in negotiating. And I would say more than anything else, if a school says that, you should take them at their word. So they've got a way of doing things. It works for them. It doesn't include the back and forth. Them telling you that is not personal. They're not expressing lack of interest in you. They just literally don't do it. And then we're kind of in the middle, which is that we found some advantage in creating a formal program. And our program, as I suggested, is called a Reconsideration Program, not a negotiation program. But we wanted to sort of make clear, okay, well, if you're going to reach out to us, let me at least tell you, here's what I want to know when you do. What's the other school? What are the circumstances? What's changed? Why Berkeley, et cetera, et cetera. So we sort of spell it out more concretely. We have a window when you can submit that application, and we will formally respond with a yes or a no. So you're not left hanging out there, and we're not left dealing with a bunch of frustrated emails as you are up against deadlines trying to navigate this. I'm not going to talk in detail about our reconsideration program. I just wanted to give you some sense, if you read this slide, of the general landscape. Please, 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 the number one takeaway from all of this really should be to listen to the school's instructions and give them what they're asking for. We're not going to ask for information from you that we don't need or want to use. And we are going to ask for all the things that we think we need. So if we say one offer only, please don't send in 4. It makes it very difficult to manage, and we're still going to stick with the first one that you sent in. If we say, you know, you can send it in whether or not you've received an initial gift aid offer or not, we really mean that. Don't reach out to us and say, I didn't submit for reconsideration request because I was waiting to receive my initial gift aid offer and it never came. So I would just read the instructions really carefully and understand that the school is trying to be as responsive as possible while also being as responsible as possible. And then lastly, a really important term for you to understand is net cost. And this may seem incredibly obvious to you, but you would be surprised perhaps to how many people we get emails from, sometimes in the reconsideration process, where they say, you know, I got a huge scholarship from this school. And then we look at it, and when you compare our tuition to their tuition, that scholarship is actually going to result in them having to pay more than they would pay for us, because even though we give them a smaller scholarship, we're less expensive. So we would appreciate it if you would do your due diligence. Probably this slide should be summarized as Excel or Google Sheets are your friend. You should start keeping track of information. What are the tuition and fees? What are the estimated living expenses? What's that total for any given school? What need-based aid have they offered you? What other aid? If you requested reconsideration, did you get anything? Do you have outside awards, et cetera, et cetera? And you take all of the costs and then you add all of the gift aid up and you subtract the total gift aid from the total costs, and that's your net cost. Now, that doesn't, again, mean you're necessarily pulling out, you know, your wallet to pay that. You may be filling out a promissory note for a federal loan to pay that. But still, you can see that there's a distinct difference. And importantly here, when comparing school A and school B, you'll note that school B is more expensive. School B costs $100,000 and school A is $20,000 cheaper. But when all is said and done, at the end of the day, when a student is making a decision between school A and school B, it may turn out that school B is less expensive because they've provided different types of aid or more aid. And so the net cost to the student is actually less than it would be for school A. Couple of key takeaways. Loans are a reality. There's really not such a thing as a full ride in law school, or almost none whatsoever. And so you should sort of wrap your head around the fact that loans may very well be a part of your reality. But there are lots of ways to reduce your borrowing and also to manage your debt postgraduate, even if you're going into a not particularly lucrative career. Schools all do things differently. Sorry, that makes things really complicated for you. We would encourage you to, as much as possible, hustle in terms of applying to outside awards, also programmatic awards. It may be possible to negotiate an award with a school. It may not. Be sure to read the fine print, and then also be sure to reach out to our offices if you have other questions. I will end there. There's some resources here that might be helpful to you on the side, as well as, a link to our financial aid planning calculator that can help you understand net cost. It's specific to Berkeley's cost, but it's a good tool potentially just to practice figuring this stuff out, as well as some other resources that are broadly available and may be helpful to you. I will stop there, and then Joseph, you can let me know if there are any questions that have come up that you think it would be helpful for me to address.
Sure. So we did have one question about applying late in the cycle. So the question is, I'm wondering, for students who apply at the end of the cycle, do they have the same possibilities of receiving similar gift aid as students who apply early?
Yeah, so I feel like this question is a little bit of an artifact of what you may have heard about rolling admissions processes. Or we're always like, oh, there's some benefit to applying early in admissions because we have all of our offers to make. And then by the end, we have fewer offers and more applicants. The reality is that it doesn't actually work that way in the world of financial aid, at least not at Berkeley. So we absolutely know that we will be admitting more people later. We have some sense of how many people will be admitting later. We also there's this interesting self-selection process where we admit, X number of people, and then some of them just disappear pretty quickly because they decide to go somewhere else. And so the pool gets smaller and smaller as we sort of zero in on the people most interested in Berkeley. So it would be really silly for us to kind of like spend all of our money in the first part of the cycle and then just be stuck while I read Joseph's application, and he's so interested and he's so great. And I've gotten to know him at all these events and I can't wait for him to come, but I don't have any money to offer him because, I'm waiting for somebody else to tell me what they're doing. That would be a bummer. So I don't think that this plays out in the financial aid sphere as much as it plays out in missions, if at all. It's true that if there are programmatic awards that you might have missed the deadline, or that they sort of have already gone through the process of selection. And so maybe the best you could do at that point would be to end up on a wait list for one of those opportunities. But for the most part, the most action around financial aid, at least for us, is really more in February, March, and April. And we've admitted everybody by then. So we pretty much know what the pool looks like and are now making decisions about who we're most interested in recruiting.
So we have two similar questions about applying for outside scholarships. So when is the time for students to apply for scholarships? Should they wait until they've been accepted? Or can they start applying now while they're in the process of applying to law schools?
In general, it's obviously going to depend on the entity that's making the scholarship offer, and they probably will say what they want. But I have found in my experience that most places just want to know that you've been admitted to a law school, and they're happy to later on learn which law school. It might be possible that there's a scholarship award that's not portable. So it's like a nonprofit that says, or a law firm that says, we're only making this to people who are attending law school in Northern California or the Greater Bay Area. And so if you decide ultimately to go to school in New York, you don't get to have that award, right? So they might want to know, and you certainly might want to know. But for the most part, it's, you know, we deal with it after the fact, where a student has already been offered an award, and then they ask us to sort of certify that they've been admitted or that they've committed to our school. So if they're available now, by all means, apply for them now. My instinct is that most of this happens starting in January. So it's really a spring project. And you can focus on your admissions process right now, and then you can get in, hopefully have some choices, fill out the FAFSA, fill out supplemental need-based aid, fill out institutional and outside scholarship awards, and most of the dust will have settled around April.
So while you're reading for admission, do you have a sense of how much financial need an applicant has? And does that financial need factor into admissions decisions?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. We're entirely need blind. We do actually have a supplemental or an optional socioeconomic background questionnaire in the application, but as we explain in the application, the purpose of that is to understand socioeconomic challenges and hardships faced, barriers to educational opportunity, and also diversity that you might bring in terms of your socioeconomic background into the classroom. So it's only asking those questions for the purposes of sort of admissions consideration. And in fact, we don't use those questions when we're looking at you for need-based aid eligibility. We ask different questions in the supplemental gift aid application. So we're really need blind. I think that that's pretty true lots of places. And I hope that it's true universally. One place that this comes up a lot, for example, is for people like international students or undocumented students, where you can know, but based on what they say about their visa status or other, that they're not going to be eligible for federal loans. It would be really easy, and I think not appropriate for anyone in financial aid or admissions to be like, well, I really like this person, but they can't afford it. So, I'm going to pass. We don't know. You don't know what resources someone might be coming in with. You don't know what's out there and that's available to them and in terms of other institutions. And my opinion is that you should be making assessments of admissions based solely on admissions criteria, which should not include ability to pay. And then for most people who are eligible for federal loans, they do have an ability to pay, even if that is their only resource. And for other people who don't have that option, we have pretty elaborate conversations with them to try to figure out what might be possible for them if their dream is to come to Berkeley Law. So we're not going to be assessing your need in the admissions process. We'll be asking those questions afterwards.
So we have a follow-up question to your scholarship reconsideration. If you can elaborate on the 2-week time period to accept the revised aid, does this mean someone has to accept the aid and admission to Berkeley in the 2 weeks after asking for scholarship reconsideration?
Yeah, so our reconsideration program is really quite formal. I'll describe for you how it worked last year. Basically, you can send an email in requesting reconsideration at any time after being admitted. We don't look at those emails until March 15th to 20th, depending on the year. And so that's when we sort of open up the email inbox, look at them, pull them all together, and then we move forward from there. We will not ask anyone to accept a scholarship offer or an offer of admission before April 1st. April 15th, April 1st. Did I say April 15th the other slide? I meant April 1st. Sorry, apologies. April 1st is the universally kind of semi-agreed upon date that we're not supposed to require commitments from, not April 15th. So, if we're not looking at them until mid-March, even if we made you an offer like that very same day, we would never ask you to commit until about 2 weeks later, which would be early April. It's a hard world, because like in the world of fairness to an individual, you might need more time. In the world of fairness to all people trying to make decisions, we cannot give you all the time in the world. We have to, if you turn down the award, we have to go to the next person, right? And they say it's not fair if we don't do that. So what we feel like is we don't want to give people exploding offers, so we won't give you like a 24 or 72-hour turnaround. And generally 2 to 3 weeks is about our window where we're like, okay, it's April 1st, here's your offer. Your deadline to respond is April 15th. That does, however, accelerate your commitment deadline, because if it wasn't for that award, you might have had until June 1st. So, you need to be aware that that could be happening. And there may be schools that only give you 2 or 3 days. That does exist out there. We think that that's probably enough time for you to kind of like assess all of your options, get other information if you need it. Here's the thing. what we require, and this is again what all schools should be requiring, and if you're wondering, there's a reference, the Statement of Good Admissions and Financial Aid Practices, or community standards that we've all agreed upon, and you can actually find it online. We can require and do require you to turn down all known final offers of admission. So if you got into school A, B, and C, and school C offered you an award for full tuition, and they said you have 2 weeks, and if you accept, you got to turn down all the other schools. You have to write to school A and school B and say, I'm not coming. And you'd have to withdraw from them entirely to fulfill your obligation to us. However, if there's a school D where you're on the wait list, you haven't received a final decision, you can remain on the wait list. And if there's a school E where you haven't received a final decision, you're still in review, you do not have to withdraw from school E either, because you have not received a final. So it's basically, we're asking you to make a commitment based on all known firm information at that time. And we're not going to require you to make a decision based on hypothetical information, or to foreclose on opportunities that might be coming down the pipe, but that you simply aren't aware of. It's not supposed to be a race. And that's one of the things that happens in admissions, is that sometimes, schools can be a little competitive with one another. And the reason why we have standards for good practice is to avoid this idea that we would just all race as fast as we could, and force you to make decisions in October or November, and withdraw from everywhere else, because that's not going to get us the candidates that are going to be the best fit for us, and it's not going to get you the law schools that are going to be the best fit for you.
Do you have time for just one more?
Sure, I'll take one more.
Okay, last question. So you mentioned that the binding early decision comes with a $75,000 scholarship, that it's comparable to other scholarships. I wonder if you can speak to that more. I was holding off on that in hopes that I might be able to get more if I apply later.
Yeah, I mean, so binding early decision is a distinct program, like different than just applying early or early action, just to be clear. And so the deadline is actually November 15th to apply binding early decision. There's no application fee. If you don't get in, you get rolled into regular decision. Everybody gets a decision. I think this year it's December 6th, at one particular time for BED. And if you get in, you have to withdraw from everywhere else. So the award is, when I have some fairness concerns about binding early decision. And I say that as someone who created the binding early decision program, right? Because if you're like, well, this is my dream school and I don't know if I'm going to get in, so I'm going to hope this tips the scale in my favor. But then the reality is you've given up options, not just of where you could have attended, but how you could have paid for it. I think there could be an equity concern there. So what we did to try to ameliorate that equity concern is to look at what we typically offer students. And we realized that not 100% of people get a gift aid offer, but of the people who get a gift aid offer, the average award is about $25,000. It can vary. I've seen it be 24, I've seen it be 28, but it's right kind of in there. And so if you apply BED and you get in, you're doing as well or even better, right? Because there's a group of people who didn't get any gift aid, as you likely would have done as the average person anyway. And we felt like that was the sort of most equitable approach. So you are not disadvantaged. In addition, if you're admitted binding early decision and you apply to the Berkeley Law Opportunity Scholarship or the Public Interest Scholars or one of the big programmatic awards, you can still be considered for that. So you could go from $25,000 in binding early decision to being a finalist for BLOS, someone who is selected, and someone who ends up with a full tuition award. Similarly, we will allow people who are committed to a binding early decision to still apply, sending a supplemental gift aid application in for need-based aid. And while the vast majority of people do not then qualify for need-based aid, every year there are at least some people who are binding early decision admits who do get an additional $5,000, $10,000, $15,000 on top of their 25 because they have a great deal of financial need. So $25,000 then is the minimum, and it could be more. However, we want to be really clear that if you would be uncomfortable, unhappy, frustrated, or disappointed with $25,000 a year, don't apply binding early decision, because even though it's the floor, it's the ceiling for most people. And we don't want you to be, hoping something's going to happen and then be disappointed. We'd rather if you be thrilled you got in with the $25,000 award, and then even more, excited to learn you got an additional $5,000 through need-based aid. And if that's not you, if you feel like you would be, frustrated or even just scared and anxious about how you're going to afford it or how you're going to manage the debt at the other end, then probably buying the early decision isn't a great option for you. And that's totally reasonable. Just apply when you're ready in the cycle and as a regular decision candidate. So yeah, that's our thinking. That's our approach. We always revisit these things from year to year. It's really important to us that we have a robust set of financial aid offerings that do meet the needs of students with socioeconomic need, do create access, and do also bring the students who most want to be at Berkeley and who are the ones we're most excited to have part of this community here each year. So you're always welcome to reach out to us. You're welcome to come to the other sessions or to watch the videos at a later time as this stuff becomes more and more real to you, or to attend the office hours and ask me anything session that I believe was on Wednesday afternoon. But otherwise, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Joseph, for your speed typing in response to all of those questions. Really appreciate it. And I will hopefully see many of you in the future.